There are three concepts you need to understand before you can touch anything with CSS: selector, properties, and values. Every CSS statement is composed of these three components, so you have to know what they are to understand CSS, not to mention write it. The basic selectors you need to remember are tag names like p, class names like imagebox, and identifiers like wrapper. There are other types of selectors you will want to learn, like link pseudo selectors, but you will understand and remember more CSS the more you code it. Properties can set all kinds of aspects of the elements that answer the selector criteria. They can set location on the page, white space around them, colors, font settings, and a lot of other things. Values are the sizes, percentages, colors, font names, and whatever else you might need to tell the browser how you want to set the specific property for the selected elements. Now this seems like a lot to remember, and I didn't even mention all the different properties or the different values. And many properties will only accept value from a very small possible values list. Well, my advice is don't remember. All the information is on the web in sites like w3schools.com, and you can quickly search to find the value you are not sure of. But if you really don't remember properties, how can you search for them? The trick is to print for yourself a cheat sheet. There is one page that stuffs together a lot of the information you need to get you started. You can search CSS cheat sheet on Google, or look at these two that seem good to me. This one has fewer properties, but it has short explanations that I think are useful. This one has more properties, so that's kind of nice. They both sketch out the box model and mention both selectors and values, because they are just as important to remember as properties. Print out the cheat sheet, stick it on your wall or notebook, and review it when you are not sure what was that thing for removing list bullets. It's very helpful. So now that you have some CSS knowledge and tools, you need to think about your project. The first thing you want to do is sketch out your design. It doesn't need to be accurate or binding, just so you have kind of a general idea about the direction you want to take the page. It will also give you a chance to familiarize yourself with the content on the page. That is important because the second thing you want to do is set up your HTML. Why do I care about the HTML? Aren't we separating the presentation from the content? Isn't that the whole point? Well, not exactly. The HTML is where we get the selectors from, so we needed to supply us with good selectors. If we don't think about the CSS when we create the HTML file, we may end up with only tag selectors. That is kind of limiting. So we want to create wrappers. A wrapper is an element like a div, or in HTML5 more semantically named elements like header and article, that we put in the HTML code because we want to logically group one or several elements together. For example, if an h1, h2, and an image of a logo or something are logically a group we can think of as the header of the page, we want to put them in a wrapper, like this div. This is a good preparation for handling them in CSS because they are so logically related to each other that we are likely to style them as a group, use the same background color, and position them in a similar way, like fixed position at the top of the page, for example. We can't do those things, or at least it's pretty hard, if we don't put them in a box together. We can still access the individual elements inside the box, but that box of h1, h2, and image is a main element in our design. After you wrapped all the elements that should go together, and don't worry if you have many such boxes within boxes, most designers prefer erring on having more of these little groups than less. We add identifiers and classes. Identifiers are unique. You can only use a specific ID on one element. If you use the same ID on another, you will get a CSS error, but it might indicate that what you really needed was a class. A class name can appear many times on elements or groups of elements like our wrapper divs that should look the same. For example, blogs have multiple stories on a page. Every story has several elements like a title, timestamp, and text, and they are all wrapped in a wrapper. It might look a little bit like this. And we can set a style for all the stories with selector, div, period, story wrapper, or you can style a specific story, Let's say on the mouse over it changes background color. Using the identifier div hashtag story-5. We can style all story headers in a similar way. So we got the HTML set up, we move to CSS. If you don't feel comfortable starting in a separate file, you can put your CSS in the header. You can always copy and paste it to a separate file later. Pay attention to the folder and files hierarchy whenever you use any kind of relative path names. Okay, so we start with properties that affect the entire page. You might want to start with the font family for the page, a width, and whether or not it's centered on the screen, background colors, images. Designers usually have a wrapper around everything inside the body, so they can assign the body one background, then a different one, and maybe a different size to the wrapper around everything else. It's a good idea to try laying out your big elements next, based on that sketch you started with. Layouts are the hardest part in CSS. Even if you understand the theory behind position, float, and the rest, when you try it out, it just doesn't behave like you expect it to. It will be hard for the first 10 or 20 or 30 style sheets you make, but you will get an intuition for it eventually. So start by looking what other designers did to create their layouts. Read CSS code of pages you are interested in, and use generators. If you Google CSS layout generators, you will get plenty of online tools. You can create a similar style to what you want and copy and paste your HTML into their HTML and use their CSS. Copying, pasting, and filling with the code is a good way to learn. You then want to add the statical style properties to finish the code. You don't need to do layout before style or style before layout, and very likely you will do them both simultaneously. For that reason, it's important to have a sketch of the design. You will get lost otherwise. Not only will you add layout and style properties simultaneously, you are probably going to debug all that time. It makes sense to create CSS in an incremental way. Add some code, see how it looks, add some more and see how that looks. So debugging is important. First, get a response, any response. I like to paint the background of an element red, because I'm not likely to miss it. I quickly remove it when I see that I'm getting the right response in the right place. Not sure my file is connected properly? Check if this is red. Want to check if my wrapper is size 800 pixels and centered? Check this if this is red. Want to check if I have the right selector for an element? If it's not red, then my selector is wrong. If more than what I want is red, then my selector is not specific enough. In any case, I understand more about the problem. That is the most important step in debugging, isolating the problem. So if I know I have the wrong selector, how can I find the right selector? If my wrapper is bigger than 800 pixels, how do I know how to fix it? To figure some of these things out, you can use tools like Web Inspector, Firebug, or if you like Safari, it has a good development tool, but you need to activate it through Preferences, Advanced, Show Developer menu in menu bar. One of the things you can do is hover over the elements of your page and see them highlighted. When the element you want is highlighted, look at the path that the tool describes and see if you left something out in your selector. Another thing you can do with some of the tools is look at all the CSS for just one selected item. You can see all the selectors your element qualified to, and as you go down the cascade, you see how old values are changed for more specific ones. You can then see the final calculated values for the element. If it's not the value you want it to be, maybe it fell somewhere in the cascade. You can learn a lot using tools, but you need to feel comfortable experimenting with them. There are many possible problems you can stumble upon while debugging, and sometimes you will abandon one approach to get the look you want and try another approach. Experiment with all options by commenting out lines. It's a good trick to keep all the code you want to experiment with together. Nudging this value and that, and trying these properties together or one at a time. Just comment out what you are not testing at the moment and erase it when you are done. Let's look at the Zen Garden as an example. In the Zen Garden, we download an HTML file, and we have to write CSS for that file as it is. So we have to trust that the setup they have is good. Since this is my first try, I'm not going to write a CSS file from scratch. I will download the sample CSS, I will look for an existing Zen garden design that is close to the design I want and modify that. I'm not allowed to use it as an actual template. I can't use the images or leave it unchanged. So first I'm going to make everything that is not displayed make it back to display. And I'm going to find another image that I could use in the header and maybe fiddle with the size a little bit because it looks a little bit too big. And I'm going to look at this area under the header. I see it's still part of the intro. So if I change the width of the intro, I need to change that part separately. So there's a lot of looking through the tools and seeing exactly what is inside which other wrapper and really kind of playing around with it.